Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're going to dive back into some Legal Eagle today. We've taken a look at the channel once or twice here now, and I saw a while back my friend Mr. Terry did a reaction to the video on The Constitution Doesn't Say That. So I haven't watched the video, and I don't see any chapters, so I don't know actually what he's going to cover in here, but I can kind of think of a few of my own that I would add to any list. So what I'll plan to do is we will watch this and we'll kind of do some commentary as we go along. And then any that he doesn't mention that I think need to be mentioned, I'll kind of add at the end, and I'll invite all of you to use the comment section to let me know what you think are things that maybe people think are in the Constitution but aren't really there. Now, I want to say up front, I know that there will be some debate on this because sometimes it's not about whether the Constitution does or doesn't say something. It's about people's interpretation of the Constitution. So some people might say, well, the Constitution does say that because they interpret something to mean a particular thing. So hopefully these are pretty black and white ones that we can all agree are like, yes, they are, or no, they're not. But I understand some of this will be open to interpretation, and that interpretation changes over time. So the link's in the description to the original content, so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Yeah, I hate to tell you, but you're wrong about the Constitution. It's not your fault. I mean, that thing is like 7 pages long. Who has time to read that? And
oh no, not 7 pages.
There's like 24 amendments. Pfft. But it's not your fault. Everyone is wrong about the Constitution. Think about this.
Wouldn't say everyone's wrong. A lot of people are wrong. Ben, you got to be careful of making generalized statements like that, because if I can show that even one person isn't wrong about the Constitution, that whole statement is false.
This phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. In 1987, the Hearst Corporation conducted a survey to mark the bicentennial of the U.S. Constitution. Over 50% of survey participants thought that that phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, was part of the U.S. Constitution. And this wasn't a one-off result.
I have never heard of anybody thinking that. People think that's in the Constitution? Really? Did any of you?
According to a 2002 Columbia Law School study, nearly 2/3 of persons polled thought that this phrase came from the Constitution or from one of the founding fathers. But this phrase does not appear in the Constitution. James Madison, the author of the Constitution, didn't say it either. So, who did? Well, this was written by none other than Karl Marx in 18.
Yeah, and I'd be careful, too, about calling James Madison the author of the Constitution. The father of the Constitution, okay, maybe. There's no single author. Just like Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but it's not his word for word. There were revisions, there were other voices, there were 5 men on that committee. The Constitution isn't the work of only one person.
1975, and then parodied by George Orwell in Animal Farm. Marx wasn't the first person to articulate this idea. Scholars trace the concept to the New Testament, which states in part, and distribution was made unto every man according as he had need.
Yeah, a lot of quotes that we attribute to people can be traced to someone far earlier. I mean, we always talk about Abraham Lincoln with the house divided against itself cannot stand. He's quoting Jesus from the Bible. Jesus was being accused of being from Satan, and he was making the argument that Satan doesn't fight against Satan. That would be stupid. He says, and he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And Lincoln went on to kind of expound on that and say, basically he was saying that the country at some point is either going to become all slave or all free. It can't remain half one and the other.
Now, the Soviet Union eventually incorporated the slogan into its constitution as, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his work, but that has never appeared in the U.S. Constitution. So you can imagine if Americans confuse the U.S. Constitution with the Soviet Constitution, they're probably wrong about a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it. One thing that people get wrong all the time is thinking that the Constitution mandates that English is the official language of the United States.
We don't have one.
That same 1987 Hearst survey found that 64% of the people believed that the Constitution made English the official national language of America.
The irony here is that there are a lot of other countries for whom English is an official language, and yet the country that has the most native-born English speakers in the world doesn't have English as as an official language, and you can have more than one official language. There are a lot of countries that have multiple, and I would be totally fine if the U.S. made, I don't know, English, Spanish, maybe a few other Mandarin, a few other languages official as well.
But English as the official language has never been part of the
That's
Constitution. True. Although English was the dominant language at the time the Constitution was ratified, many other languages flourished as well.
German.
The most common languages included Dutch, French, German, and the many languages spoken by Native Americans.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the men who fought in the Revolutionary War on the side of the American cause were not native-born speakers. I mean, there's a lot of Dutch speakers in New York. There were a lot of German speakers in Pennsylvania. You go to eastern Pennsylvania, you go to places like Lancaster County and Dauphin County and York County, even in the area around Gettysburg. You go into old cemeteries there, and you're going to see all the tombstones are in German, or eventually Pennsylvania Dutch, which is kind of this weird kind of hybridized version of English and German together.
Enslaved people spoke African languages as well as made their own English-based Creole languages. And most of the Founding Fathers favored bilingual education. Thomas Jefferson spoke English, French, Italian, Latin, and he could also read Greek and Spanish. He hoped that America would establish colleges that would teach in French, Spanish, German, and other languages.
Well, you have to understand, too, that it was a kind of a core piece of curriculum for college students at the time to take Latin and Greek. Often, many times, you couldn't even really get into a university if you didn't have a basic understanding of Latin and Greek ahead of time. So those were very, very common languages to be taught.
Others, like Ben Franklin, saw it differently and said things that were incredibly offensive and Malthusian, saying, quote, "Those Germans who come hither are generally the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation. They will soon outnumber us. That all the advantages we have will not, in my opinion, be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious." Luckily, he didn't win the day on that one.
He also wanted the turkey to be the national bird.
Now, states with large German populations disagreed with Ben Franklin, at least initially. In the 1800s, Pennsylvania and Ohio passed laws allowing German to be taught in public schools.
It makes total sense, and I wish my school would have offered German. I went to a small school, so we only had French and Spanish offered at my school. My kids have been taking American Sign Language as their foreign language in high school, at least my two that have gone through high school so far. So, yeah, there's a lot of different options. I mean, here in Ohio, heavy German population. Even in the area where I live, there's a lot of generational German-speaking peoples that came through here. And even if you go back 100 years ago and you look at the census records, German Americans were the largest group of foreign-born people in the United States. German 100 years ago, maybe not so much today. Today, you'd probably say Spanish as a second language to English. But for most of our history, it would have been German.
Of course, however, Americans have consistently attempted to limit the speaking of other languages in this country. Politicians have tried to introduce a constitutional amendment making English the official language, which would force the government to stop providing bilingual services. So far, these efforts have failed. And
yeah, see, I don't think that is helpful to force everyone. I think it's helpful to people to be able to learn English if they speak another language and they come to the United States. I think probably most of them are going to learn English unless they're in an area that's heavily another language. But listen, every time I go to Europe, 90% of the people that I encounter in Europe speak English. And it's kind of, I think, a little bit shameful that we as Americans kind of expect everybody else to learn our language, but we don't bother to learn anybody else's. I get it. We speak the language already that is kind of the dominant language of trade and commerce throughout the world. But I feel like we could do ourselves a favor and get better at learning other languages.
Well, a constitutional amendment hasn't passed. Congress historically has passed all kinds of laws that would prevent people from speaking non-English languages. For example, in the 19th century, the government forced Native American children to attend missionary schools.
Yeah.
In 1887, the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided that mission schools on reservations were required to provide all instruction in English. Children who used their own languages were bullied and beaten by the instructors. This, of course, led to immense language loss. And, of course, French was the dominant language in the Louisiana Territory for over 100 years.
Yeah.
The first Louisiana constitutions made English and French the official dual languages of the state. But Louisiana was a melting pot for different ethnic groups, and eventually their dialects merged to produce what we call
Creole.
Louisiana French. But in 1921, Louisiana adopted a new state constitution which reversed the policy of bilingual rights. The state banned the teaching of French in all public schools, which highlights one of the differences between the U.S. federal constitution and individual state constitutions. But of course, these trends continue to this day. Representative Louis Gohmert introduced the English Language Unity Act of 2021, which would declare English as the, quote, official language of the United States to establish a uniform English language rule for naturalization and to avoid misconstructions of the English language texts of the laws of the United States pursuant to Congress's power to provide for the general welfare of the United States and to establish uniform rule of naturalization under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
See, I think it makes a lot of sense for states to tackle this issue. Just because, it makes a lot of sense for, say, Arizona to have Spanish and English as kind of the languages for the government. So for example, if you made both of them the official language in Arizona, I could get a ballot then in Spanish, like when I'm voting. And that makes total sense to have that there. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to have Spanish as an official language in Vermont. It might make sense in places like Louisiana then to have, French as an official language in addition to English.
Of course, the reason that Gohmert wanted to pass this law is because it's not in the Constitution at all. And Gohmert's bill was referred to committee where it died. But putting language aside, surely that old chestnut, no taxation without representation, found its way into the Constitution.
I don't know. I guess I took for granted that people understood that was a saying from before the Revolutionary War, not something that's in the Constitution.
Right? Well, the popular history of the American Revolution goes something like this. The colonists got so fed up with King George III's high taxes that they chucked British tea into the Boston Harbor, decided Americans would henceforth become coffee drinkers, and wrote a constitution ensuring that no one would ever be taxed again without being adequately represented. Well, as a resident of the District of Columbia, I would have to take issue with this particular summary.
It actually is on their license plate, or at least it was. It says across the D.C. license plate, no taxation without representation.
American history. In the 1700s, the colonists objected to the Stamp Act and other similar laws that imposed taxes on them because they couldn't vote and didn't have representation in Parliament. And in response, the English came up with a theory of virtual representation, which meant that since Parliament existed, every British subject was represented, regardless of whether they could vote. Of course, the young American colonists didn't exactly take to this early version of Zoom meeting.
It's kind of interesting because, you can always make some argument about not being represented, right? I've had a lot of people argue to me that 16-year-olds should have the right to vote because if they have a job and they pay taxes, that means taxation without representation. And I would come back and argue, well, no. Just because they can't vote for their representative doesn't mean they don't have one. Because then the same argument would be made about a felon in some states, a convicted felon who can't vote, or somebody who's not a citizen. They might pay taxes, but they might still not be able to vote in some places. So that's one of those interpretive type of things. What does representation actually mean? Just because you can't vote, because in that time period, who we're talking about could vote even when the United States came into being. It was wealthy male landowners, white male landowners. So if you were a woman, you were a person of color, you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. Does that mean you're not represented? Well, they didn't think that was the case.
After all the pontificating about taxes and voting and the subsequent War of Independence, perhaps the biggest surprise of all is that the taxation without representation didn't make it into the final cut of the Constitution. Though the colonists did try hard to work it into the founding documents.
Really?
The Articles of Confederation incorporated a we hate taxes stance by denying the federal government the right to levy taxes at all.
Yeah, that's true. People forget that. The government didn't used to have the ability to levy a federal tax, and there was no income tax. They got most of their money from tariffs. A tax on imports is basically where all the federal revenue was coming from.
Sounded cool on paper, but was a really big mess in reality because the new government couldn't pay its war debts. It also couldn't raise enough money for an army or navy. The British occupied forts in the Great Lakes while also dumping its convicts into the colonies. And so for this and many other reasons, the Americans had to write a new governing document that eventually became the Constitution. And you had better well believe that it gave the federal government the right to levy taxes. The problem is they forgot to mention that in order to levy taxes, everyone needed to be adequately represented. The state and local authorities also got the power to levy taxes, but the end result is that the Constitution doesn't guarantee no taxation without representation. But the motto is still a rallying cry for the disenfranchised populations, especially in the nation's capital, where I live, Washington, D.C., which is also the only geographical entity in the contiguous United States whose citizens must pay taxes and register for selective service without having political representation in Congress. Well, at least political representation that can actually do something.
I was going to say, there is a representative for DC in Congress. They're just a non-voting member. So yeah, again, what does representation mean exactly?
DC residents pay more taxes than residents in 22 states and pay more money per capita to the federal government than any actual state. Now, we are not the only ones. Who else pays taxes without representation? Well, undocumented immigrants pay about $7 billion a year in taxes. Inmates pay taxes, and so do formerly incarcerated people, even if their voting rights have not been restored. American children work and pay sales tax and income tax, but they lack the representation of a vote. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole bunch of taxation without representation in the United States.
And again, I would take issue with that only from the standpoint that it depends entirely on how you define representation. I have a congressman. If I don't vote for that congressman, does that mean I'm not represented? I'm still represented. Actually, I don't have a congressman right now because we have a special election coming up because our congressman just became the president of Youngstown State University. I've actually met him. He's a nice guy. But actually, the guy who's probably going to become my new congressman is married to one of my high school classmates. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, it's all, like I said at the beginning of the video, it's a lot of this is open to just what you mean by words and what phrases mean and what sections of the Constitution mean.
And that's probably because the Constitution doesn't guarantee that right. Americans hate taxes, but they love shopping, and a lot of people think that they have a right to enter a particular store, or at least they have a right to contract with other people, the freedom to contract. This guy believes he has a constitutional right to eat at the Trump Grill in New York City. But here the police officer contends that a reservation is not a constitutional right.
It's not a guarantee.
They can't revoke my reservation.
It's not a guarantee.
Yeah, they
It's
can.
not a constitutional right.
The protester is in fact wrong about his constitutional right to keep his dinner reservation, but this is an interesting question. Do people have a constitutional right to enter a store or a restaurant? The Constitution is often silent about most things, so it shouldn't be surprising that no one has an explicit reference to where people are allowed to be. But the 1980 U.S. Supreme Court case Pruneyard Shopping Center versus Robbins said that the Constitution does not give people an absolute right to enter and remain on private property, even if they intend to exercise their First Amendment right to free expression. So if this man wants to get into a restaurant to protest, he doesn't actually have a constitutional right to do.
No, and as he shouldn't. Would you want people to be able to stand on your front porch of your house and protest? No, you don't want that. There's got to be some degree of boundary available to people with their private property.
So, despite the First Amendment. But what about if the city or state government has imposed a vaccination requirement to enter? Does that violate the Constitution? Well, so far the answer is no, because not all unequal treatment violates federal or state laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 explicitly prohibits restaurants from refusing service to customers based on race, color, religion, or national origin. A restaurant can't refuse service to black people or white people or Muslims or atheists, for example, but when it comes to other classes of people, it's a complete toss-up. They can do what they want. Restaurants and business owners have argued that they have a religious right to refuse service to gay and transgender people because of the owner's religious beliefs. Now, the Supreme Court has yet to definitively settle that issue, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the Supreme Court over the next few years on this particular issue. It's definitely going to come up. But when a local regulation prevents unvaccinated people from entering a restaurant, which is what happened with the situation in New York City, we're not talking about a protected or quasi-protected class of people based on their race, ethnicity, or gender. That means a lower standard of review, in other words, rational basis review, which basically no law ever fails.
And yeah, the issue here is that how far do you take a law that was passed over a very specific set of circumstances? How far can you interpret that to apply to people that aren't mentioned in it? So a great example of this that often gets used is the 14th Amendment, which was passed in the aftermath of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are kind of the civil rights amendments in the aftermath of the Civil War, in which they're giving rights to the freedmen, as they're called, the newly freed slaves, men and women and children, and giving them things like citizenship and for men the right to vote. But the 14th Amendment was also the basis for things like the Roe versus Wade decision, which was not envisioned at the time that the 14th Amendment was passed, but the court interpreted it to cover that set of circumstances. Of course, now they've since reversed that decision. And so it's all, again, about interpretation. Does a law that protects people based on gender, race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, can that law be extended to cover other groups of people? That's the question.
So the bottom line is that the Constitution is not going to protect your dinner reservation if there is a specific enforceable law that says you can't go inside. Then there is a phrase that I think everyone is familiar with, the idea that the criminal law presumes that you are innocent until proven guilty. Now, that idea that you are presumed innocent until proven guilty is one of the most significant principles in American law. The rights of criminal defendants are very much part of the Constitution. For example, the Fifth Amendment bars self-incrimination. Quote, "No person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself." This is known as the right to remain silent. The Sixth Amendment requires that people be given a speedy and impartial jury trial, an attorney in criminal prosecutions, and establishes defendants' right to confront adverse witnesses. And the 14th Amendment provides for due process of law. However, the Constitution does not require that a state prove that someone committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And the Constitution doesn't say that you're innocent until proven guilty. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of innocent until proven guilty...
Right, these are things that come from other laws and other sources rather than the federal Constitution.
...is not important. But the bigger point is that not all fundamental rights can be sourced directly to a line of text in the Constitution.
And in fact, I think it's important to note that the understanding of the framers of the Constitution was not that they were laying out for people what rights they were given from the government. It was quite the opposite. In their mind, they were seeing it as a way of laying out limits on what the government could do to infringe on the rights of the people. It's just a very different way of looking at it.
Astute legal eagles probably already know that many of our important legal principles come from English common law. But the presumption of innocence has a more complicated origin story. It isn't found in any of the sources we traditionally cite for English common law, like the Magna Carta or the English Bill of Rights of 1689, or treatises by Coke and Blackstone. In fact, this presumption comes from Roman law and canon law, which form the common law of Europe. And eventually this principle made its way into common law in a very roundabout way. In Coffin versus the United States, the Supreme Court held that the presumption of innocence was a bedrock concept in the American criminal justice system. Then Justice White credited this to an Irish jurist named Leonard McNally. McNally was known as a zealous advocate for Irish defendants who were accused of treason. And during McNally's lifetime, the British system required 2 witnesses to prove someone guilty of treason, unless the accused was Irish, in which case 1 witness was sufficient.
Oh, man. This is interesting, though, because it's interesting to look and see that even in 1895, Supreme Court justices were making reference to sources that were not part of the United States legal system, because there's been a lot of outcry against the fact that that happens sometimes today, that some, particularly it tends to be from my side of the aisle, the conservative side, where people criticize some of the more liberal justices for referring to extra national sources, like from European sources. And you can argue one way or the other about that. I'm just saying it's important to note it's not a new thing that people do that.
After McNally's death, the English press found out that despite his years of advocacy for the presumption of Irish innocence, McNally was, in fact, a double agent. He represented Irish revolutionaries in court, but reported on their activities to prosecutors for at least 26 years. Despite McNally's dubious role as a double agent for the government, today the principle of innocent until proven guilty is fundamental to the criminal justice system in the United States, despite it having no reference whatsoever in the Constitution itself. Now, that's just the tip of the iceberg of things that you're wrong about the Constitution, but this video isn't over because there's another Legal Eagle video about even more things that you're wrong regarding the Constitution. Not you obviously, but your friends probably. Things like the filibuster and the separation of church and state. And this full-length companion video exists exclusively on Nebula because sadly, if I put it on YouTube, it'd probably get demonetized and there's no way that you'd ever see it.
Yeah, that's probably, unfortunately, true. And yeah, the separation of church and state is one that I would add. And again, that is one of those that's just a matter of interpretation. What does it mean when the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free practice thereof? What does that mean? Well, the actual phrase separation of church and state, most people, when they refer to that, they're referring to a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote where he said there should be a wall of separation between church and state. But understand that at least at that time, Thomas Jefferson was on the more extreme end of the interpretation of the First Amendment. Just like there is today, there are differing viewpoints on what does that mean. Does the First Amendment mean that, for example, you can't have an opening prayer at a government meeting, or like in Congress when you have a chaplain offer a prayer? Is that a violation of the Establishment Clause? Well, that depends on who you ask. Thomas Jefferson would be more on the side of maybe saying, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have that. Others would be on the other extreme of that, which is to say that no, what all that meant was there's no state religion, because they were coming from England where there was a state church and people had to pay a tithe to that church, whether they were a member, like a believer in that or not. If you were a Muslim, you still had to support the state church. So those are kind of the two extremes of that. And in between is kind of where most people are when it comes to that. Does, for example, the fact that that churches don't pay certain taxes, like they don't pay taxes on the money that comes in that is given in tithes, but churches do pay some taxes. Is that a violation? Things like that. So those are the kinds of questions. But the actual phrase separation of church and state does not appear in the Constitution. It's really just about the interpretation of that First Amendment and where you stand on that. So that's one of the great things about our country is we can have those discussions. We can have those agreements and disagreements. And I invite people to continue that conversation down in the comment section. As always, I just ask that we can disagree without being disagreeable. You can respect other people's views. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but you don't have to say, you're an idiot for thinking that. No, you can say, you know what? I see it differently than you do, and here's why. And that is completely acceptable and will always be welcome on the channel. So as always, let me know your thoughts, and I'll throw some links on the screen for you. Notice how careful I am to not say the words throw up on the screen. I keep thinking about that at the end of videos now. I'll throw some links up to some other videos that might relate to this topic for you to check out as well. Thanks for watching.